Stephanie, who asked, what if reality is terrible? What if reality is terrible? Now, Stephanie, sorry to hear about terrible reality. I have to be sensitive here, and because I know that, people are going through difficult stuff. There are very difficult situations. But the idea that reality can be terrible at the level of principle. So if we're being absolutely honest about the way that things work, then it's simply not possible for reality to be terrible. Reality is just what is. Reality is the situation that we find ourselves in any given moment. The terrible bit comes from here. The terrible bit comes from, separation has to occur for a start, because for something to be terrible, there has to be a notion of it being able to be better, which you've already got duality there. You've already got things separated out. And terrible in relation to what? And so we've got categorization, and we've got judgment going on there, and analysis, and it's all happening in our belief system. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Reality appears terrible to me sometimes too. Absolutely. But to be at peace with the now is where it's at. Acceptance or surrender. And when we hear that, our little left brain goes, fuck that. I'm not accepting the way things are. They're terrible. I'm not having that at all. Don't want to listen to what this guy's saying. So I found a little reading that I myself found to be so helpful. And it's from a book you've probably heard of, called The Power of Now, by Eckhart Tolle. And I read this book donkey's years ago in my, I didn't read it. I dipped into it during my personal development days about 15 years ago, maybe a bit longer now, as part of the huge odyssey of just hoovering up personal development materials. And I dipped into this a few times, and I just couldn't get on with it at all. I just thought it was a load of crap. I really did. I thought it was bollocks. It's like, this guy just doesn't get it. It doesn't make any sense. Even if it did, I can't see how to apply it. I mean, my left brain was in overdrive back then. I thought it had to be way more complicated than what he was pointing to. And I even forgot that I'd owned the book. And then a couple of years ago, when I'd had these insights about how we experience the world, and I'd started to kind of like build up a little bookcase. I've got a bookcase in my room. It's got about 80 different books, all written from the inside out perspective now. And I looked at my old personal development shelf that had dust growing on it, because most of it was just unnecessarily complicated and looking in the wrong direction. I mean, how do you... the whole notion of self-help and personal development, when you see that self and that person are essentially constructs of thought, well, it kind of puts a different spin on the whole domain of personal development entirely. So, and I looked, and it's like, oh look, there's that Eckhart Tolle book, The Power of Now. I've got a much better appreciation of the present moment these days. Let's have a look at it. I read it again. Absolutely blew my mind. It's like, why couldn't I see this before? Why couldn't I see it before? So, what I'm about to read might not make any sense, but I'm going to read it anyway because I think it's really helpful. And it's all about surrender and acceptance when things look terrible, okay? He says, to some people, surrender may have negative connotations, implying defeat, giving up, failing to rise to the challenges of life, becoming lethargic, and so on. True surrender, however, is something entirely different. It doesn't mean to passively put up with whatever situation you find yourself in and do nothing about it. Nor does it mean to cease making plans or initiating positive action. Phew! So we don't have to sit around like vegetables when we become present to life. Brilliant. Surrender is the simple but profound wisdom of yielding to rather than opposing the flow of life. The only place where you can experience the flow of life is the now. That's number one on our list. You can't experience anything else but the now. So to surrender is to accept the present moment unconditionally and without reservation. It is to relinquish inner resistance to what is. And one of my mentors, Mark Howard, actually defines mental health as acceptance of what is. That's how he defines mental health. Acceptance of what is. It becomes particularly pronounced when things go wrong, which means that there is a gap between the demands or the rigid expectations of your mind and what is. Okay, can you see that? Is that the resistance comes from that self-referential thought process that's going on, that is creating the separation and the categorization and the judgment and the analysis. That is what creates the feeling of tension. If we surrender to what is, to the present moment, to the now, that goes away. It's what he calls the pain gap. If you've lived long enough, you will know that things go wrong quite often. It's precisely at those times that surrender needs to be practiced if you want to eliminate pain and sorrow from your life. Acceptance of what is immediately frees you from identification with the mind and thus reconnects you with being. So he's talking about these two different experiences here. He's saying acceptance of what is immediately frees you from identification with the mind, with the story, with the jibber jabber that's all being made up by your left brain that's trying to keep you safe, but it doesn't really know, and it's just making stuff up, doing its best. It frees you from identification with that and reconnects you with being, which is way more in line with the right brain experience of the here and now, of love, of oneness, and all the good things that come from that. Surrender is a purely inner phenomenon. It does not mean that on the outer level you cannot take action and change the situation. Hear this, people. I'm going to read that again. Surrender does not mean that on the outer level you cannot take action and change the situation. You can. In fact, it's not the overall situation that you need to accept when you surrender, but just the tiny segment called the now. You're surrendering to reality. You're surrendering to what is. Anything that's not now is categorically a story. So by surrendering to the present moment, you're surrendering to reality. You're in life. Remember the diagram? You're either in life or you're in your head. You're either living it or you're thinking about it. It's that same binary nature of things that he's pointing to here. For example, if you were stuck in the mud somewhere, you wouldn't say, okay, I resign myself to being stuck in the mud. Resignation is not surrender. You don't need to accept an undesirable or unpleasant life situation. Nor do you need to deceive yourself and say that, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with being stuck in the mud. No, you recognise fully that you want to get out of it. You then narrow your attention down to the present moment without mentally labelling it in any way. This means there is no judgment of the now. Therefore, there's no resistance, no emotional negativity. You accept the isness of the moment. Then you take action and you do all that you can to get out of the mud. Such action I call positive action. It is far more effective than negative action, which arises out of anger, despair, or frustration. Until you achieve the desired result, you continue to practice surrender by refraining from labelling the now. So you refrain from the analysis and the comparison and the beliefs. You relax. It's a real relaxation, like letting go. It's so relaxing. It takes huge amounts of energy to live in here. It really does. And you know, if you're exhausted, it's because you're living in here. So someone then says, they follow on and they say, look, I can see if I'm in a situation that's unpleasant or unsatisfactory, and if I completely accept the moment as it is, that there'll be no suffering or unhappiness. I get that. I still can't quite see where the energy or the motivation for taking action and bringing about change would come from if there isn't a certain amount of dissatisfaction. What a great question. And he says, in the state of surrender, you see very clearly what needs to be done. So that's like, you know, if there was a fire now, you know, I wouldn't need to have a debate about whether the fire was a good thing or a bad thing and whether I liked it or not or I didn't like it or not. I'd clearly know what to do. Be a very stressful situation can't be stressful at all. Situations don't hold meaning in and of themselves. They just are. But I'd know what to do. I'd be very focused, very clear-minded. That's available to us at all times. You take action, doing one thing at a time and focusing on one thing at a time. Learn from nature. See how everything gets accomplished and how the miracle of life unfolds without dissatisfaction or unhappiness. That's why Jesus said, look at the lilies, see how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. If your overall situation is unsatisfactory or unpleasant, so if reality is terrible, separate out this instant and surrender to what is. That's a flashlight cutting through the fog. Your state of consciousness then ceases to be controlled by external conditions. You're no longer coming from reaction and resistance. And when you spot that you can only ever experience the present moment, that there's never anything else, then it's just a process of surrender to each moment that comes along. Then you can look at the specifics of the situation. Ask yourself, is there anything I can do to change this situation, improve it, or remove myself from it? If so, take appropriate action. Focus not on the 100 things that you will or may have to do at some future time, but on the one thing that you can do now. You can read 100 personal development books and they all say the bloody same thing. Focus. One thing at a time. David Allen's Getting Things Done is a brilliant book. It's got nothing to do with the principles. It's got nothing to do with the inside-out understanding. But it's pointing to exactly the same thing. It's pointing to exactly the same thing. You can only ever do one thing. The rest of it is all story. The rest of it's a creation of the left brain. This doesn't mean that you should not do any planning. It may well be that planning is one thing that you can do now. But make sure that you don't start to run mental movies, projecting yourself into the future, and so lose your connection to the now. Any action you take may not bear fruit immediately. Until it does, do not resist what is. If there's no action you can take and you cannot remove yourself from the situation, then use the situation to help yourself go more deeply into surrender, more deeply into the now, more deeply into being. When you enter this timeless dimension of the present, change often comes about in strange ways without the need for a great deal of doing on your part. Life becomes helpful and cooperative. And I hope you've seen that. I hope you've had experience of that yourself, because I certainly have. When I'm in the flow of life, like this is why I talked about career change for so many years, because I could see that when I was present to life, when I was guided by my intuition, when I was having that right brain experience, when I wasn't over-analysing things and I was going with the flow, that's when life presented me with opportunity. That's when random people would have random conversations with me that led to huge changes in my life. That's when circumstances aligned to take me in the direction that I wanted to go in. That all came from being present to life. If inner factors such as fear, guilt, or inertia prevented you from taking action, they will dissolve in the light of your conscious presence. Do not confuse surrender with an attitude of, oh, I can't be bothered anymore, or I just don't care anymore. If you look at it closely, you'll find that such an attitude is tainted with negativity in the form of hidden resentment, and so is not surrender at all, but masked resistance. As you surrender, direct your attention inwardly to check if there's any trace of resistance left inside you. And this is this whole thing about really being in tune with your feelings. Really being in tune with your feelings. When you're in the flow of life, it feels great, it feels fine. When you're resisting life, your feelings tell you about it. When you're busy putting your feelings onto something else, when you're falling for the outside-in misunderstanding, and it looks like your feelings are coming from somewhere other than thought in the moment, well, brilliant. You've got your feelings telling you how you're doing, how much you are surrendering to reality, to the present moment.